In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use the EcoSystem materials. All right, so let's go in to our material editor, and you'll see that we're starting up with our material that we created in the last lesson, and we were using a volumetric material. Now, what I want to do at this point is go ahead and select the base material here, and you'll see that this is a simple material. Let's go ahead and turn this into an EcoSystem material. Now, once this has been created, you'll see that we have an EcoSystem material, and then we have that simple material below it. Now, we want to make sure that we leave this alone because this is actually the underlying material that is needed for EcoSystem materials. All right. Now, the first thing that we see with EcoSystem materials is we have a general panel here, and this is where we're going to choose the type of ecosystem we want. So at the bottom we have load rock, or we have add plant. Now we could also add an object that we've created in another 3D package that we could load in and import as part of our ecosystem. We're just going to use what's default inside of View. So let's go to add plant, and I'm going to go to my trees, and in here we should see, well, let's actually just use a bush. Let's not use a tree at this point. Let's just use this dry bush, try to keep our polygon count low here. So let's hit OK on this, and we'll just use this one. Now, once we're finished with the ecosystem that we want, we can go ahead and move on. Now, if you want to add more to your population, you can continue to add plants just by clicking Add Plant and then choosing whichever one you want, and that will appear in the list here. Right? So just to show you, I'll just go ahead and go to bushes here. Let's do this bush one summer, just to kind of give ourselves a little bit of variable color. Now you need to wait for that to load in. It may appear as if it's frozen, but it really hasn't. You just need to wait to populate that. Now inside of our general parameters, you'll see that we have that underlying material. We need to leave that exactly the way it is. And then we have our display options. Now I like to stay with the shaded billboard, but if you find that ecosystems are making your machine a little unstable, you could switch to billboard and maybe that'll help. But I only stay with these two. I will not go up any higher here because sometimes we get some instability. I'm going to allow for full camera quality when it's near the camera, and I'm giving it a radius of about 150, and that's the default value that View will give you. Now let's move to density. Now overall density is going to determine how dense our ecosystem is going to be in one specific area. So if we go to a higher amount here on our density, we're going to have ecosystems or plants and rocks and things like that. It's going to be very compact, and it's going to be very thick to get through. Now this also increases your render time and could possibly even cause some instability if you are not using this dynamic population. Now I'm going to switch this down to about 40% or so, and I'm going to go ahead and check that dynamic population, because what this is going to do is populate my ecosystem on render time only. Now if I want to see what my ecosystem looks like inside of my preview window, I could just hit preview and it'll populate that and show it inside of my scene here. Now you'll see that this is bringing my ecosystem in on top of this terrain and not over the entire thing. So we'll talk about how to control our ecosystem here in a moment. Now before we move on and start doing any more work, let's clear this out so that way we have plenty of room to continue to work inside of View without any unnecessary crashing or anything. Now you could come in and you could check the or avoid overlapping instances, and that's basically where plants will not grow right on top of one another. Normally, if I have a sparse density, I really don't have to worry about that too much. Now our placement, we can force regular alignment of instances. Now what this is going to do is remove the randomness in which our ecosystem is placed. So if you take a look at your general parameters here, you've seen that the distribution here is set to random. Now we could also drive this distribution with a function if we wanted to, but we're going to stick with random here. So inside of density, if you want this to appear nice and neat, you could always force that. Now obviously we have sampling quality boost. This is going to increase the accuracy in which your ecosystem is going to populate along some sort of parameter control. Okay. Now offset of surface. This frame or this section here allows you to control how ecosystem population is placed relative to the surface of the underlying object or your terrain. So if we adjust this, it's going to offset our population above our terrain or even below our terrain. Normally we want it to populate right on it, so we'll have this set to 0 feet. Now you could do this absolute from surface, or you can do it proportional to size of the instance itself. So I normally like to control it based on the surface. Now we have variable density. This is going to allow us to use a function to tell the population where it can grow and where it cannot. So if you want to check this, this will allow you to choose a function. And let's say I come in here and I like a certain pattern or something like that. I want it to grow within, I don't know, let's come in here and let's do something like this. My population is only going to grow in the white areas and it's going to ignore these black areas. So if I do a preview of this, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but we're still going to have some randomness in these white areas, but absolutely it will not populate in these black areas. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove or reset this function and turn that off because that's not something that I want really. I can clear that and do another preview, and you'll see how that creates another random generation of our population. Now this next section is called decay near foreign objects. And if we have rocks or rivers or other objects that are not part of the ecosystem, it's going to decay to where that ecosystem is not going to overlap it. We will have zero penetration with that. Now it may also scale some of your ecosystem elements like grasses and bushes and things like that. It may scale them down as they get closer to those foreign objects. Now you can also adjust the influence and the fall off of that in which that happens. Now you could also populate below foreign objects as possible. So if you have a foreign object that has a bit of a slope to it or kind of an overhang, you can actually populate ecosystems underneath that. So we would want to go ahead and populate below foreign objects as possible. Now we could also use a slope influence on our density as well. So if we want our objects to appear on slopes and things like that, we can adjust this as needed. All right, now let's move up to scaling and orientation. Now the overall scaling is going to adjust the scale of our species in our ecosystem. So this is on a global effect. So anything that you have in your list, whether it's a large tree, small rocks, or even small bushes, they're all going to scale at the same rate using this here. We can set up a size variation as well. So we have maximum size variation. We can size them up in the X, Y, or Z, and then we can keep their proportions. We can do uniform 100%, or we can do anything between to where it's non-uniform. So we have kind of a variable sizing here. Direction from surface. Normally we want things to be vertical, but every now and then we want some of our plants to kind of grow on slopes and things like that. So we can adjust that accordingly here. Now rotation is going to control the local rotation of the plant itself or the species itself. So the maximum rotation that it could reach is 120 degrees. Okay, we don't really want anything to go 180, and that will just flip underneath the terrain. We could also do variable scaling, and again we could drive this with a function if we wanted to. Now at lower densities we can have them shrink. So as they begin to disperse, we want the plants to get a little smaller. And this is a very natural thing with plants. As they grow further apart from one another, they could become smaller and smaller. Okay, so you could adjust the influence, radius, and fall off on that as well. Now we could do lean out at low densities, and this is kind of reflecting the how do I want to say this? This is kind of reflecting the way plants lean and trying to reach sunlight and that sort of thing. And at lower densities, they don't really grow up against one another, so they can really grow at any direction. So at low densities, they may wilt and change. Okay, so I don't really want to lean this out or anything because we're just working with bushes at this point. Now our next tab that we have is our color panel. And we can change the overall color of our plant species if we wanted to. So right now it's taken into account of the species that I have in my ecosystem and generated an overall color. Now if I want to change this, I could do so. So I could change this to something like an orange, and these plant species will appear to be a little more orange, as you can see here. Now if I want, I could reset this and go back to our default. Okay. We have color at low densities. Now at lower densities they may appear to be a little more dead, because at lower densities it's going to be gradually making a transition from full plant life to possibly dirt or even rock. So if we want the color to decay, let's just change this to something along a brown color, lighter brown, and we'll hit OK on that. And let's go a little lighter than that. Okay, we can have that decay. We can give it its influence and that sort of thing. But let's clear and repopulate, and you'll see that some of these at lower densities that are out by themselves are that decayed color there. Now we could also drive this with a function for our variable color. Okay, so if you wanted to check that and adjust that as accordingly, you could use this as a function. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and reset that and then turn that off. Now our presence is going to determine the overall presence of our plant life. Now right now we can see that our plants are growing at a higher altitude and they're not getting anywhere near these lower altitudes. So let's say that I wanted this to spread all the way across my terrain. Well, first thing that I see is my altitude constraint. It's set to a range right now. It's set to 0.25 and 1. So 1 being the highest point. And if we drop this down, we can even go into the negative values. Now, if I drop this down to negative 0.5, and I clear this and preview it again, you'll see that I get more of a population at my lower altitudes, which is what I'm looking for here. Now, this fuzziness is going to determine it kind of creates a blur around the edges. So we could create a fuzziness at the top to where we begin to lose some of that density up there, and then at the bottom it's kind of a fall off, if you want to think of it that way. So at the bottom, if I want it to appear to be less dense, I could adjust this fuzziness at the bottom. Let's go to about 50%. Let's clear and preview, and you'll see that it begins to disperse a little bit more. Okay, and we have more density up here and less down here. Now, range of altitudes, we could do by the object, by the material. We could do an absolute area or relative to the sea. Now, normally I like to do by the object because I'm creating this for the terrain that I have. Now we have slope constraint, which works exactly the same thing. You can adjust these sliders to create a constraint in which these plants can grow. So if I don't want them to grow on a specific slope, I can adjust this. Let's go to 90, and let's clear and preview. Give this just a minute to preview. And you'll see here that it's not populating anything because we're not within a range on our object here for anything to grow. So let's drop that back down. Let's preview, and now we can grow. Now, if we don't want this to grow on very sloped surfaces, let's drop this down. Or very steep surfaces, I'm sorry. So these sliders can go both ways here. Clear, preview, and now they're appearing more on the tops instead of on the slopes. Again, we have that fuzziness that we can adjust. So we can adjust the fuzziness of the steep areas and then the flat areas. Now we have orientation constraint, and we could set a preferred orientation for all of our plants, and we could set up our orientation tightness. So a preferred orientation would be something like we would prefer all of our plants to grow at an orientation of 90 degrees. Now this is probably going to look a little odd, but let's preview this. And you'll see that our plants are beginning to orient with the slopes. Okay. Some of them may even appear a little more vertical than others, and you can begin to adjust this and experiment with the orientation of the plants themselves. Okay. Now we have fuzziness that we can control that as well. So with our preferred orientation about 90 degrees, let's hit OK, and let's do a quick render of this. So we can see that even though we're using our hypertexture that we created in the last lesson, these species are being created on that surface. Okay? And we've created an ecosystem that we've controlled using those material controls. And we have it growing at higher altitudes, and some of the slopes that are a little more steep, we get less density. On the flatter areas, it's more dense. And you can begin to experiment with those on your own and really get a sense of how this is controlled. All right, so now we're going to learn about the final material type, and that's going to be layered materials. Now, it's not a specific material type that we saw in our material editor, but we are going to learn how to use the different types of materials in this hierarchy to create layered materials. So I'll see you in the next lesson.